Iran has a much stronger hand today than it did back then. Iran's nuclear program is much more developed, thanks to Trump. Thanks to Trump. Because of Trump, Iran halted its commitments to the nuclear deal. Again, Iran is fully committed to the NPT, and it abides by the legal framework that exists within the International Atomic Energy Agency. But the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, limited Iran's nuclear industry. So since Trump tore up the deal, Iran developed its nuclear industry. And so now Iran is one of the most advanced countries in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. It is probably in the top 10. And this is something that Trump will have to accept. You can't just say you have to give it up. That's never going to happen. We're not going to go back to 2015 anymore, because this is not the same nuclear program, as Dr. Arokci rightly pointed out. So Iran's military is different today, and the United States is in a much tougher situation because of the global challenges with Russia and China, the major problems that they face at home. So there is always a potential for a deal. There's always a potential there's nothing can be ruled out. But at the moment, because of the attitude of the United States, the Iranians have no interest in negotiating. If the United States changes its attitude and shows that it can be trusted at some point down the road, the Americans are going to have to take all of these into consideration. And I think, based on American and Western claims, we've seen that impact in Russia. We've seen, according to the Americans, that Iran drone capabilities, they're having a daily effect. The second is that Iran's missile and drone capabilities are infinitely different from in the past. Iran's military capabilities are far greater than what they were. Iran has chosen a very smart route to make a strong, inexpensive, relatively speaking, high-tech military industry, which can defend the country. Trump was the person who weakened his own hand, partially at least, when it comes to the nuclear program itself. When countries in the region refuse to sanction the Israeli regime, when they refuse to break off ties with the regime, when Erdogan is refusing to end trade and business with the regime, where he refuses to stop flights to Ben Gurion Airport, how can we expect China and Russia to make big steps in the right direction? If these regimes did take steps, then that would create an environment where other countries would do the same. But so far, none have done it. None of them have made a move. Especially for China, Iran is a bit different. For example, the Emirates, their number one trading partner is China, but then they go on to tell the Americans that we're going to do all of our investments in the United States. And that, of course, is not something that pleases the Chinese. So for China, Iran is very important because Iran is independent. They can trust Iran. Iran is not going to obey the United States when it pushes policies that are anti-Chinese. But the countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf will abide by American demands, more or less. But that aside, China and Russia obviously have a lot of influence, and they have a lot of ways. China needs stability in the Persian Gulf region, and just like everyone else. And China does not have an interest in war. And unlike during the previous Trump regime, China's trade with Iran is much stronger now. Russia's relationship with Iran is very different from back then. Russia back then was much weaker than it was now. The United States has been declining, the West has been declining, Russia and China and the global South have been rising. The situation is different today than in the past. So China wants a stable Persian Gulf region. China also has an interest in having independent actors in the Persian Gulf region be strong. So China and Russia do have a role to play. Again, this is all speculation. At the moment, China continues to buy Iranian oil, and it has refused to abide by U.S. demands. Things have changed since 8 years ago. China is stronger today. China recognizes that listening to the United States only makes it worse, and the United States comes back with new demands every time they back down. China is more independent of the United States now. They do less trade because of the U.S. sanctions and tariffs. So China has diversified its trade with other countries. So it's less vulnerable. Iran has a strong hand for the reasons that I've mentioned, and adding these two also. But it's going to be a very complicated situation in our region. But the root issue is the ethnic cleansing, the slaughter of the Palestinian people, which the United States supports and the West collectively supports, even though they're divided over Russia. They all support the slaughter of women and children in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank. And as the more this continues, I think the more dangerous the region becomes for the West. And I'm not talking about Iran, I'm talking about instability, broader instability. If there's a war, and then their infrastructure is fair game. They can't, if the Americans attack Iranian infrastructure or military targets, that's war. And so these regimes won't last more than a few hours or a few days. And you would see chaos across the Persian Gulf region. And then there would be no more tankers. The tankers would all be at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Let's just look at the map, the Persian Gulf. Iran owns half of the Persian Gulf. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf, and the northern side. And it's not a very wide piece of water. It's thin and long. And look at where U.S. bases are in, like in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Bahrain, in Kuwait. If the United States attacks Iran, these tiny countries are all complicit. What does that mean for their future existence? That would create a global economic catastrophe that I think is historically unprecedented. And it's not something that the Americans can do about anything about. They can't do anything about it. So no more oil, no more gas. I'm sure in Iraq you will see the resistance preventing oil and gas getting to the West. Probably in the Republic of Azerbaijan, you would see similar moves of people outraged. War in this region would destroy the US economy. And then imagine people on the move from because the world economy will collapse. Imagine people on the move everywhere. And where will they probably go, even though the United States and Europe will collapse? They'll be going to the United States and Europe. The amount of people going now would be just a trickle compared to the what we'll see if the global economy collapses. So I don't think that the United States wants this. I don't think that the military wants this. Of course, Netanyahu would love this. Fanatical Zionists, ethno-supremacist madmen want this, but I don't think at the moment the US military would allow such a thing to happen. Nothing is for certain, but Trump is definitely not a very, how should I put it, stable person. You cannot, he may wake up in the morning and then suddenly say something different from what he was saying the night before. But I think that the stakes are simply too high for now. Look at Yemen. Americans want to Yemen, which is it's we have it's clear that Yemen's military capabilities are not a very small compared to Iran's military capabilities. The people of Yemen are heroic, they are brave, they are courageous, and they are the heroes alongside Hezbollah. They and Hezbollah sacrifice themselves for another people. That's unbelievable what they've done and what they're doing. But Iran's military capabilities are second to none in the region, and the region is very, very sensitive because of oil and gas, and because of the petrochemical plants, and because of the refineries, and because of all the ships, and because of all the trade, and also because of all the desalination plants and all that. It's very vulnerable situation. These are all glass palaces. These are all glass mansions. But again, I can't rule anything out. And if the United States strikes, then I think if it's serious, then I think we will see people flee the Persian Gulf region before it happens. The rats will jump ship because they know that will be the end of these tiny regimes. So people will leave immediately. And I think the family members of the dictatorships, which have all their money or a lot of money in the West, they will be among the first to go. So what the Iranians are doing is that they're speaking with their friends in Moscow and Beijing and discussing the upcoming indirect negotiations with the United States so that it would be impossible for the Americans to drive a wedge between Iran's relationships, whether with Russia or China. And from my communications in Russia and China, when I travel, or when they invite me, or when colleagues come to Iran and we speak, they have the same sort of issue, and that is that the West and its affiliates, they try to create an environment of concern in Russia or in China that Iran is about to do a deal with the West and it's going to sacrifice the Chinese relationship or it's going to sacrifice the Iranian relationship. And the same is true with Russia. All three countries are facing the same sort of problem and the same sort of psychological warfare. One key objective is to make sure that the United States or its partners, if there are any left, although I'm pretty sure that the Europeans will continue to be poodles when it comes to Iran. The objective is to prevent the United States from creating an environment where they can divide and rule. Because you always see how, for example, in Iran, the Persian language media that beams in from the West, that's funded by Western government agencies or Western agencies linked to the Western government, they're constantly saying that the Russians are betraying the Iranians, the Chinese are about to betray the Iranians. We've always been hearing this throughout the years, especially during sensitive moments and junctures. The United States wants the sort of country that can be milked, like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a huge amount of oil wealth, but if it goes to war with the most impoverished, when it invades and tries to destroy and carries out a genocidal war against the poorest country in the world, meaning Yemen, it fails. Why? Because the United States has done nothing for Saudi Arabia. It is a vulnerable and weak and broken country that can spend its dollars, but it cannot even create a defense capability that can lead it to some slight. They lost the war against Yemen. Not only did they fail in winning the war, but ultimately the Saudis had to accept the ceasefire when Yemen began to destroy key Saudi oil installations. So that is the end result of U.S. domination in any country. So he would
Yeah.
use the military to stop the war. So the United States invaded Iraq basically. Just it doesn't make sense what he says. Or he spoke about the Iranian economy. In fact, the Iranian economy, when the United States ruled over Iran for decades, and the British before them, was terrible. The Iranian even though Iran was exporting huge amounts of oil, the Shah of Iran was basically spending huge amounts of money purchasing American weapons. Of course, the United States wanted that, but the country did not have its decisions were not made in Tehran. Its economy was definitely not doing well. More than half of the girls in Iran were not even going to school under the Shah. And I don't even want to go into Shah's mentality towards women because he basically said women should just look pretty and shut up, basically. There's an interview about him speaking on women online that people could look at. So, this very progressive Shah was someone who did really nothing but harm to Iran. But that's what the United States wants. But in any case, if the United States were to treat Iran with respect, and the words of Trump, as explained by Witkoff, do not indicate that. And the words of Witkoff do not indicate that. But the reason why Iran is not negotiating with the United States is because the United States is speaking using the language of threats. The United States does not recognize Iran's sovereign rights. And right after this interview, by the way, I think I didn't look in detail because it's the Iranian New Year, so I've been very busy with other things. But apparently, the U.S. National Security Advisor, if I'm not mistaken, he said that the position of the United States is that Iran has to give up its nuclear program. That's not what Witkoff says in this interview. It's very different from what he said. And that shows that if the United States cannot respect Iran's sovereign right within the framework of the NPT, then I think that's a non starter. We cannot even talk with Americans. Iran's rights within the NPT have to be fully preserved. As long as Iran is in the NPT, Iran doesn't have any intention to leave because Iran does not have an intention to build a nuclear weapon. And as Iranians have said many times, that Iran does not want to have a nuclear weapon. And the only way in which would Iran's nuclear posture would change would be if there is some sort of existential threat against Iran through some sort of nuclear strike. or a potential nuclear strike, then things would change, obviously, as it would change in any sane country. But as long as Iran is in the NPT, and Iran can legally withdraw from the NPT, as long as Iran is in the NPT, Iran will abide by its commitments to the NPT. And as we speak, the Iranians are abiding by their requirements within the framework of international law. And again, going back to what Witkoff said about Giuliani being a changed man, about everyone else being a terrorist, about Hamas's position being unacceptable, basically meaning it's unacceptable for Hamas to insist on what Witkoff himself accepted before. That is not a good indication, to say the least. And that is why Iran does not negotiate with the United States. That's why we do not have direct negotiation. He spoke about back channels. Back channels have always existed. Iran has always been, and the United States they've always sent messages back and forth through different back channels. So that's nothing new. No one should be surprised there. Yeah, I think that the war in Yemen, or the genocidal attacks on Yemen, have probably three purposes. One is to make the United States look strong, and that's how America works. And presidents in the United States get popular when they bomb countries. That is one of the sickening things about American society today. Of course, it's the mass media, the corporate media, or the legacy media, that mainstream media that pushes this narrative. But in any case, leaders in the United States become popular when they attack countries, when they bomb countries. Even Trump, during the height of Russia, the anti-Russia sentiments in the United States being promoted by the Democrats and his opposition, and Russiagate, when he bombed Syria, suddenly the mainstream media supported him. Until then, he was illegitimate and a foreign agent, and then they were rooting for him all overnight because he was firing missiles at Damascus and other cities. That's sadly how it is. So they're trying to help the Americans. What the Americans are doing is that they're bombing Yemen so that Israel could more easily carry out genocide. That's basically it. Witkoff actually, again, from the bits and pieces that I've read, seem to be saying that the resistance has been destroyed or weakened severely, and so ultimately Iran shouldn't be that powerful anymore. But on the other hand, we see that the focus is on weakening Iran. So it's somewhat, if the resistance, if the axis of resistance has been demolished and has been weakened so much, then why on so much insistence on having a confrontational approach with Iran and all the threats and so on? So in the case of Yemen, I think part of it is to look strong, especially since Trump is going to have to give huge concessions to Russia to achieve any sort of peace agreement. So I think that is a distraction. Second is to help the Israeli regime, because the siege in the Red Sea is costly. The Ansarullah is blocking the Red Sea to ships destined to Israeli regime ports, and because they blocked food inside Gaza, and this was before the genocide began again. And the third reason is it's like sending a message to Iran that we're bombing Yemen, and look, you're next, or you're potentially next. But the point is that, or the issue is that the United States has failed so far in Yemen. And it's not as if Biden didn't try. Biden regularly bombed the country. He regularly carried out airstrikes and people across the country. And it's very costly for the United States, because they have to bring ships, each of those aircraft carriers and other ships, it's very costly for them to be there. The planes, when they fly to bomb the people of Yemen, it's very costly, these airstrikes, especially since the aircraft carrier has to move far away from Yemen to protect itself. So instead of sending a message that frightens Iran, what it's doing is it's sending a message that the Americans thought they can do something, but they're miscalculating, and they have miscalculated. And every time Yemen strikes back with drones and missiles that are very inexpensive, high tech, but inexpensive, the Americans have to use very expensive missiles to defend themselves. So this is going to be very costly, and ultimately the Americans are going to fail. Yemen is a very sophisticated society. It is maybe the oldest civilization on this planet, and they are very smart people. They have universities. They have very innovative people, and they had a military industry before all this began. And I'm sure that the Iranians are assisting them. which they should, and the Iranians do not hide it. But it's not as if it's all the Iranian. It's just Iranian assistance. These people have huge capabilities, but it's not as if Iran is sending weapons there. The Americans have been trying to impose a siege on Yemen for a decade now. The Iranians are obviously assisting them, but Yemen has its capabilities, which are deep underground. The country is not small, it is large, it is mountainous. People are smart, it has a large population, relatively speaking. And therefore, I think a victory for the United States under these circumstances is just not possible. This is a government. The government of Yemen, which controls the capital, is running a country, and part of their responsibility, one of their responsibilities, is to develop an indigenous defense capability, because we saw the Saudis and the Emiratis with Western support carry out a 7-year genocidal war. And then we saw the Americans constantly bomb Yemen when Yemen tried to stop the genocide in Gaza. So obviously, they're going to develop their capabilities, and Iran will assist them. The United States is a monstrous regime, and people see it for what it is. The hypocrisy doesn't work anymore. Trump actually had the opportunity to use that moment when he established the ceasefire to present himself as a man of peace, but he destroyed that too, like what Obama did. Obama, when he came to power, remember he got the Nobel Peace Prize for doing nothing. And Obama earned huge soft power as a result, because he came right after George Bush and the illegal war in Iraq. And so Obama came, and many people were optimistic about change. He was a mixed race and so on, but he destroyed that too. He demolished that. But Trump, I think, has demolished American soft. Biden and Trump have demolished American soft power in a way which has never happened before. But these Arab dictatorships and others, through money and funding, they've taught them to be filled with sectarian hatred. In the West, for decades, people have been taught that Iran is evil and despotic and so on. But now I think everything has been exposed. The West has been exposed. They don't care for those people. They are Amalek. For Western journalists in the Washington Post, in the Guardian, in the Times, France 24, they're Amalek. Even for Al Jazeera, Yemen, they're not. They're helping the Americans in Yemen. These journalists who support the West, or they see all these Palestinians, they see the Lebanese as itself. When the war between Hezbollah and Israel was going on for a year, before it became an all-out war, their coverage of Lebanon was really disgraceful. The hypocrisy, everyone has been exposed. And I should add that those who kept saying Iran is hypocritical, Iran is doing nothing, why is it that all the hatred of Trump and the United States is directed towards Iran? Those who kept saying that, why isn't Iran doing anything? Without Iran, the resistance would have collapsed. That's what Trump wants. They know that the resistance, the axis of resistance, they know where its strength comes from: the heroism of the fighters and the communities and the countries, Yemen. They know that Iran is supporting all of them. Iran has made huge sacrifices for well over 4 decades. And then these despots who kept speaking about Palestine or supporting verbally Hamas, they're aiding the United States, they're aiding Israel. And they keep attacking Iran because they want to distract attention away from their own complicity. So everything has been exposed. It is Iran and the axis of resistance that is standing for the Palestinian people, and all those regimes in the region and beyond, they're simply hypocrites. They're doing nothing. They're only trying to benefit from it, or to limit the cost to themselves for their inaction and, for the most part, open complicity.